Thank you. Our last speaker is Roberto Stefan Foa. He's a lecturer in political science in the social and political sciences at the University of Melbourne in Australia. He is a principal investigator of the World Values Survey and has published a variety of articles on the quality of government, democratic transition, comparative social indicators, social trust, and patterns of global civil society. He conducts field work in Central Asia, India, and Africa. His academic publications have appeared in a variety of journals, and recently his work has been discussed extensively in the New York Times and on social media about the potential decline of liberal democracy. Please welcome Roberto.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ken, for the introduction, and let me say also thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. It's really a huge pleasure, but also a great honor to appear on this panel. And also, I feel like in the World Values Survey, we're always meeting up in Doha or Moscow or Buenos Aires or someplace, and it's also just a great pleasure to be back here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, after a number of years since my last time here. So what I'll be presenting today, just over the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, as Ken has mentioned, we have a number of big projects inside the World Values Survey dealing with trends in civil society and democracy and religion and subjective well-being, and many of these projects that are still ongoing, including projects I have with Ron. And just in the next 20 or 30 minutes ahead, I'll be presenting some striking findings looking specifically at religion and secularization, and really updating some of our research using data from the latest World Values Surveys from the sixth wave, as well as data from some other sources, which shows that the trend towards secularization, not only in this country or in Western Europe, but really across the world, has accelerated over the last 5 years, and that in particular we're seeing a pretty sharp uptick, and perhaps a surprising uptick, in what might be considered radical secularism or radical secularism or atheism. So there is a paper that goes with this, so if anyone would like to read the paper, please just drop me an email and I'll send you a copy, and I know that this is the perfect audience to be getting some feedback on revising some of the models, which we're still tweaking it a little bit right now, but the data we have all together. So really, as a way of a premise to this research, secularization theory, and it's no secret really that secularization theory by the late 1990s was considered something of a discredited theory in the social sciences, that whereas in sort of heydays of modernization theory in the 1950s and 60s, it was generally believed that religion would have a steadily declining influence in public and private life. By the late 1990s, a number of anomalies to this theory had started to build up, and at some point, of course, when anomalies build up, they become unignorable. And the anomalies for secularization theory by the late 1990s seemed pretty unignorable, such as the outbreak of religious conflict in places that we used to think of as being secular societies, such as former Yugoslavia or Northern Ireland. Obviously, the rise of religious parties and movements in much of the developing world, including but not limited to India and Israel, Turkey, or the Arab Middle East. The return of religious faith to the post-communist world, the restructuring of international relations on the basis of civilizational identity, and certainly within the Huntington framework, civilizational identity essentially being religious civilizational identity, as well, of course, as the rise, as it's become more prominent in the 2000s, of jihadi ideology and international terrorism based around religious radicalism. So for those reasons, secularization theory had fallen very much out of favor. And all of that changed really with this landmark book Ron Inglehart published together with Pippa Norris in 2004, Sacred and Secular, where they really showed the merit of the World Values Survey as a project, of really being World Values Survey the only long-term source of data on global trends, whereby we can actually really look empirically trends in what is going on in terms of people's religious faith and religious practice and the link between religious beliefs and politics. And what they showed is that actually the classical modernization approach to secularization was true in many societies, that actually in vast industrial societies we really do see secularization transformation, particularly in places that's very clear in the data since the World Value Survey started, in Ireland, for example, or Spain, or parts of Catholic Europe, and even perhaps not in Mexico, but in some parts of Latin America. In Chile, for example, we've seen some of the secularization trend really occurring in a fairly short period of time. But nonetheless, religion has not disappeared from global politics or from international relations. And one of the key reasons why that is, one of the explanations that Ron and Pippa had put forward, was really linking secularization theory to demography and showing that, well, religious individuals have more children, but also religious societies have much higher rates of fertility. And therefore, at the global level, the secular population has not been increasing as a share of global population. So religion, the religious population, still has a very important, a significant demographic weight within the world. So that was really a key contribution, and one of a number of contributions that Ron has made over the course of his career to reviving and defending and showing the importance of a modified version of modernization theory. That if we think of classical modernization theory, led us to see the world really just on a sort of single trajectory, that we're all basically on one line, there's one line, and that we're all as societies on different points along this line. And of course, such a theory is very easily criticized when it comes into confrontation with the empirical data, which shows that countries are not moving necessarily all at the same rate, and that countries, of course, there are many countries that are not on this line, so that we only need to look at the United States or Israel or the Arab Gulf to see parts of the world that are very, very wealthy, very prosperous on a per capita basis, but certainly with respect to religion, do not appear to be highly secularized, which leads critics to shift to this third option, which is just to completely reject the modernization framework and to assume that all civilizations are basically on their own trajectory, on different lines, different trajectories, and not moving to the same place, not starting from the same place. So sort of not much that social scientists interested in coming up with generalizable theories can do in such a civilizational framework. And really Ron's big contribution has been to outline a modified version somewhere in between these two, sort of a revised modernization theory, which accepts that all societies start from different points, that in the Arab Middle East, people may be starting, or perhaps in Mexico, the starting point with respect to religion, for example, would be to have a very high level of religiosity for reasons that are completely unlinked to socioeconomic conditions. But nonetheless, that certain kinds of socioeconomic influences can push all societies into the same kind of direction over time, and that we can show this with data. Okay. So briefly, before I get on to the most recent data, very, very minor update or contribution as well that Ron and I made some years ago to this debate on secularization. Again, looking at the data and showing, well, the data actually don't show any real increase in religiosity in developing societies over time. And so we really need to look to other explanations to understand why it is that religion appears to have become more important in public life, in particular in many developing countries with the rise of religious parties and movements. And again, we sort of add another possible caveat explanation there, which is that this is really to do with what's happening at the level of elite politics, that in many societies, such as in India or Israel, you had a sort of secular liberal post-colonial elite that had a dominant political party in the early years after independence, and that has been replaced now by, so to speak, a more democratically rooted but actually sectarian nationalism. But actually, that's a change at the level of elite politics, but at the level of society as a whole, there hasn't actually been an increase in religiosity. Okay, so what's been going on then in the last 5 years? What can we learn from World Value Survey about trends in religion and religiosity? So what I'll be presenting to you in the next few minutes is data that it combines not only the latest round of the World Value Surveys, but also which run to about 2010 to 12, but also some data that I've added to that from one of our colleagues, Ijaz Gilani, the principal investigator of the World Value Survey in Pakistan, who also has run additional projects. Has run additional projects pulling together global data from 2014 and 15 for about 60 or 70 countries, in which a number of the same items on religiosity that we use in the value survey have also been included. So he very kindly agreed to share this data so that we could put together a combined global data set with the longest existing time series about attitudes to religion that I believe exists anywhere. That we put that together and can start putting together some of these time series trends. So first of all, one of the items that's been in the World Value Survey since the very beginning is this item on whether you consider yourself to be a religious person, not a religious person, or, as a third option, a convinced atheist. And one of the things we've seen, and people have often criticized secularization theory as seeing the United States as an outlier, but actually the time series data don't seem to suggest the United States is an outlier in any way, or at least since 2000, the United States has perhaps ceased to be an outlier. The proportion of Americans who say that they're religious has actually been declining pretty rapidly. It's actually lower in the United States today. There's a lower proportion of the population in the United States today who say they're religious than was the case in the Netherlands when the first World Value Survey was done in the Netherlands in the early 1980s. There's been quite a rapid transformation. You can see here, so basically just with the added data from Ijaz, that has basically given us the extra 2015. This basically World Value Survey is running up to here, and then we just have this additional 2014-15. And what you can see is actually that basically the trend, it doesn't seem to, the addition from a different data source doesn't seem to have changed the trend in any way. The trend seems to be pretty continuous. The slope is pretty much the same there. Similar trend obviously in the EU, much has been written about trends in secularization in the developed world, also for what it's worth in developed Asia. One of the things I find actually is quite interesting is when we turn to the developing world, which again is often seen as an outlier for secularization theory, and one of the areas of the world upon which critics of secularization theory have pointed to. Actually, what's kind of interesting is that we do see something of a similar trend taking place in some parts. So it's not true in the Islamic world, where there appears to be, at least at best, a somewhat flat line with respect to the portion of the population who consider themselves to be religious. But surprisingly, we do see in sub-Saharan Africa a small drop-off, and that's actually both in Nigeria and in South Africa. And we see that in the time series data, a slight decline from really an exceptionally high base. Perhaps quite surprisingly for some people, we also see this in India, which has clearly had an increase in the salience of religious politics, but actually at the level of people's reported religiosity is at the lowest level in the most recent data that it's ever been going back over time. Also, again, Mexico may be an outlier, but in Latin America, actually, we see that same trend there. These, of course, are incredibly high levels, so there's 75% here, so we're still looking at societies that are overwhelmingly religious, but it would appear to imply that a secularization trend, in fact, is actually at work. Now, as I sort of promised, one of the trends that we see is not only a decline in the proportion of the population who say they're religious, but actually really one of the most striking trends is actually an increase in those who go for the third option. So those individuals who say that they are convinced atheists, and when you're given the option of saying you're non-religious, but you actually opt for the third option of saying you're a convinced atheist, that implies quite a hard or quite an extreme degree of secularism. And one of the things we see in the data is that if we compare just the first available survey from most countries with the most recent data, the proportion of the population who say they're convinced atheists has pretty much shot up everywhere. And some of those increases have been pretty big. So we see that not just in much of the developed world, which include the countries down here. We see that, for example, even a number of post-communist countries, which is perhaps quite surprising given the literature suggesting that God has returned in the post-communist world, and actually, so for example, in the Czech Republic, you have now a third of the population who say that they're convinced atheists, and at the end of the very early years of democratic transition, when the first surveys were done on this question there, it was significantly lower. But actually, interestingly, even in places where perhaps society as a whole, there's a still really large number of individuals who say they're religious, such as in the Arab Middle East, or indeed in Mexico. There appears to be a kind of radicalization of secularism. There appears to be a lot of people who are shifting from saying they're not religious to now saying that they're absolutely convinced atheists. And that's a really interesting transformation in the data. We can see this by region, so it seems to be pretty much a universal trend. The only exception here is really in the sub-Saharan Africa and Middle Eastern data. There's really not so much movement going on. But everywhere else, since the first surveys were done in the 1980s, early 90s, up to this 2014-15 data, you can see really large increases in atheism, particularly here, actually, in the United States. The proportion of Americans who say that they're atheists now has absolutely shot up. It was something like 1% in the first survey in the early 1980s, and now it's more like 6 or 7%, which is actually pretty high by international comparison. So there appears to be a real increase in radical secularism. And so I decided to sort of play around with the tree map function in R and just see, how we could map the increase in the global atheist population over time. And one of the great things we can do that with World Value Survey data now, because the data covers 95% plus of the world by population. And we can see that a lot of this increase is driven by Asia Pacific and in particular China. But if we look at the absolute numbers, we can estimate that in the early 1990s, the convinced atheist proportion of world population was something like 670 million, give or take, which would have been about 12.7% of the population at the time. Whereas by the most recent round of the data, the convinced atheist proportion of world population would be estimated at something like 1.2 billion individuals, which is an increase in the share of world population. Is now like 1 in 6 people in the world who will say that we estimate will say they are convinced atheists in surveys. And one of the things that's kind of fun is that even if we take out China, if we say, well, China is just sort of skewing this, and maybe a small change in the survey data result for China, which maybe we don't trust due to response bias and so on, would blow all this out the water. But even if we take China out and just estimate for the world ex-China, the increase in global atheist population, we can still see that there are pretty big increases that are spread. There's still basically a sort of doubling of atheist population over time, and an increase in the share of world population. And of course, we can see also that North America in 1980s would have been an insignificant proportion of the world atheist population, but now actually, if you're designing a kind of atheist book tour for Richard Dawkins or something, you put North America on the map because there's a lot of potential readers there today. Okay, so before getting into some models, I'll just show you some data on intergenerational change. Obviously, we don't know what's going on here yet in terms of distinguishing life cycle effects from cohort effects. But if we just look at the most recent data and just look at different generations, one of the things that's quite striking is that younger respondents are much more likely to say that they are convinced atheists, and that's something that we see in pretty much all or most major world regions. You can see this really huge spike in the proportion of young Americans who say that they're convinced atheists. So among millennials, it's now more than 10% of Americans who will say identify as convinced atheists. It's a pretty small number, just 2 or 3% among the older generation of Americans. But what's quite surprising is you can see this cohort pattern seems to exist more widely. So if we look at just the Middle East, a sample based almost entirely in the World Value Survey data now on Arab Middle Eastern societies. What's interesting is that you can see that younger Arabs are much more likely to say that they're convinced atheists than older generations, and in fact the proportion of millennial Arabs who say that they're convinced atheists is actually higher than the proportion of retired Americans who say that they're convinced atheists. And that would perhaps appear to be something of a transformation. But of course we want to know whether that's a life cycle effect or whether that's actually a cohort effect that might actually reflect eventually a time series trend down the line when we have more data, then we can track this for a while. Okay, so a number of questions arise that I'll sort of briefly address in the time remaining. So we want to know whether this is a period or a cohort effect. We want to know whether this is something that is country, region specific. We want to know whether or not this is a problem, potentially a problem with the survey items we're using, and whether we can find the same thing across different surveys or different items. And then we probably want to think a little bit about why this is the case. So is this a robust period cohort effect? So we put together a number of models, which I won't go too much into detail, but we tried various different kind of age period cohort cuts. Obviously, these things would, you can't include all three things together. They would linearly predict. So we tried, first of all, just taking some intuitive cutoffs for age period cohort. Obviously, no need to dwell on this table for too long, partly because when you have such a wonderful thing about World Value Survey is that, you get to have almost 400,000 valid respondents. So, of course, that means that, statistical significance becomes substantively insignificant because everything is significant. So what we want to be able to do is estimate effect magnitude. And so I'll show you some various different estimates of effect magnitude for the two variables that we care about here, the period effects and the cohort effects. So first of all, so that was just some logit regressions. If we sort of take out the logit coefficients and we sort of estimate the marginal effect and the mean, sample means, we can see that the period effect, so just taking pre-post 2001, which we can intuitively think might have been an important period break in people's attitudes to religion worldwide, obviously in America, but also more broadly, we can see that the estimated period effects after we put in various controls, I should just point out that there are obviously various controls in here as well, including regional dummy variables, which there wasn't enough space to include in the model. But so when we look at the estimated period effects, we can see that these are actually pretty large. So these are sort of red extra blocks here that's just showing the extra increase in the proportion of the population who would say that they're convinced atheists. Looking at post-2000 data to pre-2000 data, so we can see a pretty large shift there. What's kind of interesting is that as well as a period effect, there's also a cohort effect. So cohort effect, so here we are, we're looking at the estimated magnitude of cohort effect for the sample mean after plugging out the logits. You can see that there's also a somewhat smaller cohort effect that appears to be taking place as well, and then of course the conjunction of the period effect and the cohort effect explains some of the time series shifts that we are therefore able to see in the data. Obviously, one of the questions we want to ask is whether these are country or regional specific. Now, of course, we have the descriptive data, so we can see that at a descriptive level, most recent surveys appear to show higher levels of atheism than was previously the case. Now, there's a number of different ways that we can, econometrically address the issue about whether there's a country-specific effect. One of the things that you can do, with a survey as large as the World Value Survey, one of the simple ways we can address this is simply to rerun the models on each individual country. So what I'm just presenting here, I shifted to doing OLS rather than logit so I could get some coefficients that are kind of substantively interpretable without having to do complex calculations for you. So if we just do an OLS regression on each individual country sample, and then we look at, so the first one I showed here, was the period effect. So this is the effect of surveys after 2000 versus pre-2000, and this is just the OLS, so we can interpret these substantively. What we can see is that on each individual country sample, when those models are rerun, we find that for most of them, we have an effect, and in fact, in most cases, a significant effect, a significant coefficient there. Suggesting that in individual country cases, and we can see this is not just in Western countries, this is also true in China, we can see it's true in a number of post-communist countries like Czech Republic, we see it's true in parts of Asia like Taiwan. So it seems to be pretty broadly based period effect that has occurred in terms of people's atheism. But we do the same thing for cohort effects, and we find the same thing. Not always as significant in many cases, but certainly the magnitude of the effects are there, and it appears to be something that's pretty broadly based. There's only a couple of countries actually where the coefficient moves significantly in the opposite direction. So it seems like there is actually something global taking place here. It's not just driven by one or two countries in the sample. Is it item or survey specific? So one of the questions might be whether the semantics of the question matter, or one of the critiques might be putting together the additional data from 2014 with the World Value Survey data from before that might have introduced some problems methodologically that's driving this result. But actually we see the same thing. So if we look at International Social Survey Programme, they've been asking similar things in their questions from 1990. The proportion of the population in their surveys who say that they're extremely extremely non-religious, right? So looking at those at the radical secularism end of the spectrum has actually increased in most cases in their data over time, as well as the proportion who just say they're atheists, who say they don't believe in God, and that's also increased in their data over time. So this is not just something that we're seeing in the World Value Survey. I can come back to that later if there's time. Okay, so just to wrap up. So what's going on here? Why secularization? Why now? There appears to be this really large period effect. It appears to be really widespread, and there also appears to be a cohort effect that is not as large, but it's still pretty big, and was also widespread across the world, not just in the US and Europe, but also in many developing countries. So what's going on? What I would say is that this indicates there's been a kind of punctuated equilibrium. There have been cases like in the US where you've had pretty stable high levels of religiosity for a long period of time, but clearly something has happened in the last 15 or 20 years that has shifted public opinion in a radical way and has started a trend towards greater secularization that is still ongoing and may continue for some time. And what's kind of surprising is that it's happened somewhat independently. So when we look at other items on post-materialism, for example, that we haven't seen some of the same trends. In fact, we've seen kind of reverse trends, as Alejandro was pointing out, in a number of areas, particularly towards nationalism versus cosmopolitanism or attitudes towards democracy, and actually have moved in the opposite direction. But secularism has really increased. So why is this taking place, and why in particular are we seeing a kind of, not just in a time when people are talking about radicalization of religion, actually what we're seeing in many societies is a radicalization of secularism, right? That secularism has become more radical. So why is that taking place? And I think that what we need to do is move towards a kind of two-step modernization theory, perhaps, right? So if we're thinking about secularization, socioeconomic modernization can generate the conditions that make secularism possible, and that was really one of the key contributions, I think, of Ron's work with Pippa in 2004. But societies can resist that pressure for a really long time, right? There's no particular incentive. Many people just don't care about religion enough to identify as actively religious or non-religious, and so that just leaves a large number of individuals who are kind of in the gray zone without a strong incentive to move one way or another. And then you can have a kind of punctuated equilibrium. So, in the United States, the United States is obviously a point of economic development where a large number of individuals were sort of passively religious for a long period of time. But then with a particular event takes place, such as September 11th in the United States, that pushes religion into the public domain and makes it a topic of debate, and makes it something people are confronted with and need to think about, then that can suddenly shift attitudes quite quickly. And in particular, I would argue that the exposure to religious conflict is one of the factors that punctuates the equilibrium. And one of the ideas I would like to explore is whether this has been true, not just in Western countries today, but perhaps has also been true historically, that many of the countries in Europe that historically were the first to move towards secularization and secular values, going back several centuries in time, such as in England or Netherlands or Switzerland, were precisely those that had religiously sectarian conflicts. And if that's the case, then there's an interesting research implication that we'll have to explore, which is that, contrary to what is widely believed, the spread of sectarian conflict in parts of the world, including in the Arab Middle East or in South Asia or in Africa today, could be just as likely to produce a shift towards secularization as to revival of religion in the long run. Thank you.